Good morning, everyone. I'm Silvia Mastrolembo from Italy, from University of Brescia currently, and a couple of months ago I still was at Politecnico di Milano, where this study was developed in collaboration also with other experts from UK and USA, as you can see. This study is related to the implementation of virtual reality in the design review process, and in particular with a focus on procedural considerations and practical implications that have to be taken into account when planning to involve clients and end users in VR-aided usability-focused design review sessions. In particular, I will start stressing the motivation behind this research, and I will highlight the scope of the study and the related research question. I will briefly describe you the methodology applied and the first results obtained, and I will also state, of course, some limitations of the research approach that pave the way for future works and research scenarios. First of all, why did we want to focus on VR for this topic? Because in the last year there has been a growing adoption of virtual reality systems in our industry, and in particular a renewed interest in immersive virtual environments since the previous research efforts that are dated back to early 2000s. And this is aligned with the ever-increasing adoption of building information modeling procedures and technologies that is characterizing the ongoing digital transition of the industry. And in fact, a building information model could be an effective starting point for the development of a virtual facility prototype. In product design, a virtual prototype is known as the anticipation of a product that can be explored, tested, and evaluated before being physically realized. And using immersive VR, for example, stakeholders are allowed to experience a design proposal in full scale, in an intuitive and engaging manner, through immersion and sense of presence. There are several purposes and use cases VR could be adopted for in our industry, but we decided to narrow the scope of the research down to the convergence that is currently ongoing between building information modeling implementation, VR adoption, and the principles of soft landings, which requires a smooth transition from design to operation through the early involvement of the end users. And this is aligned with a research background that is working on the impact that digital innovation has on the value for clients and end users, so for the demand side of the building process. Previous works have already identified some of the benefits that could be related to VR implementation in design review and stakeholder engagements. For example, they go through probably a better spatial understanding of design proposal to the experiential spatial human experience. And in particular, what is important according to the literature review is the possibility to explore the virtual facility prototype from the egocentric viewing perspective of the end users. So the clients and the end users are able to interact with the virtual facility prototype from the perspective they use to interact with the built environment. And why is it important? It could be important because in this way, the gap in understanding between designers and the demand side of the process could be reduced, and the participation from the demand side could be enhanced, with the aim to feed back into the design stage some comments coming from the ones that are going to use and operate within the building when it will be built. Despite the growing adoption of VR systems, anyway, there are still some limitations and obstacles to its effective implementation in the industry. And it's interesting to note that the same limitations reported in the early 2000s are still reported in the more recent works related to VR implementation, and they could be related, for example, to the need for a systematic session protocol. So how should I implement VR in the process of a design review meeting? Other factors could be what is the most appropriate level of detail of the VR representation. Unguided navigation, for example, could have an effect on the quality of the design review meeting. Again, other factors, previous experience with VR systems from the stakeholders involved, the risk for the novelty effect, the risk for motion sickness, they are all factors that have to be taken into account if you want to implement VR in an effective way during your design review meeting. So, within a wider research that we are working on that is related to the development of procedural guidelines for the effective implementation of VR in this type of design review meetings, this work is focused on the development of a list, a framework of procedural considerations that have to be taken into account to guarantee the effectiveness of the design review meeting. I'm going to present you just the first step of this work. Actually, in the last months, this has been further developed, and there will be another opportunity to talk about that. But in the first part of this work, we started with an inductive research approach based on qualitative methods for data collection and data analysis, and we involved a representative panel of design stakeholders in the VR-aided usability-focused design review of a new school building. In this case, we wanted to involve clients, designers, and users, and also an accessibility expert, who is also a wheelchair user, to evaluate the immersive the VR systems and the procedural considerations that have to be taken into account. In this case, in particular, we used a semi-immersive VR system, but it was used just because of its availability, and the type of technology is not within the scope of this study, but the user experience while using it is within the scope of this study. I have to say that semi-immersive VR has been preferred also because people are able to interact while using semi-immersive VR rather than full immersive virtual reality systems. The semi-immersive, the data collection phase was structured using semi-structured interviews as a method, and in particular they were organized as the last phase of the meeting. The meetings with the representative panel of stakeholders were organized into 4 phases. They were first introduced to the objectives of the meeting, to the technology they were going to use, and during the VR session, they were asked to review operational requirements of functionality and effectiveness of the school building they were going to navigate into. Then, during the semi-structured interviews, we collected their opinion about the process-related aspects related to VR implementation. And the interview plan was organized into 4 main sections coming from the literature review. So we asked them to comment the contractual aspects of VR implementation, level of detail for VR preparation, the possible benefit for communication with clients and end users, and stakeholder engagement. Each interview was recorded and then analyzed within a software for qualitative data analysis. So by means of an iterative process of coding, the starting schema was then organized into primary codes and subcodes in order to support the analysis of this data. And as you can see, the contractual aspects were not well discussed during the meeting. People are still focused on the level of detail. For example, designers are focused on time and cost for them to implement VR in an effective way within their own workflows, while clients and users are more focused on stakeholder engagement and communication. For example, if we look at the interviews as word clouds, it's quite interesting to see that the keywords for designer were just B-model, virtual reality systems, while if we go to the end users, they don't talk about the technology they used during the meeting, but just about the possible benefits for them to better understand the spaces and their possible use in relation to the activities that they will have to perform in those spaces. They started to imagine themselves within this building. I'm not going into the details of all the interview transcripts and analysis, of course, just a couple of examples. From the contractual considerations, the role of VR, according to some of the interviews, is related to the possibility to have a more transparent way to analyze design reviews from the perspective of the ones that are going to use the building. The level of detail and realism of the VR representation is one of the major problems because it has to be managed based on the objective of the meeting, for example, to select an option, to validate the design choices, to the people involved, and also to the time and resources that are available for the design team to prepare the VR representation. But at the same time, it has some relation also to the procedural aspects. For example, people are more involved in the solution finding process, where when decisions are not when the representation is not a final representation, so there is a space for making comments and suggestion, for example. From the point of view of the communication, of course, people need a different type of media. So what we could suggest is not to include only VR systems during a meeting, but an interactive workspace with different media. For example, in my case, 2D drawings and VR systems were both available. What was missing was an annotation system. So what emerged, it was the possibility to use, for example, a BCF, Beam Collaboration Format annotation system to collect comments directly within the build model or otherwise within the common data environment where all the design is managed, for example. From the stakeholder engagement point of view, comments are coming from both the area of procedural considerations, how to manage the design review session, and more in general, the potential, the benefits of VR for soft landing processes. And according to the procedural considerations, for example, the designers, but also clients and end users suggested a guided navigation because in this way, it is possible to focus on the real objectives of the meeting, for example, and not being distracted by things that have not to be taken into account in this specific session. And they were just some examples. In the paper you can find a more detailed description of everything. But what we developed is basically, in this way, in this version, it was a sort of checklist organized in topics of things that have to be taken into account. So VR systems are not just a technology to implement in design review processes, because otherwise they could be useless, but they require a certain level of preparation and a certain level of time and the decisions to be made before the design review session itself. Of course, this study at this level had some limitations in relation to both application of findings and generalizations based on the methods used. For example, we didn't take into account specific design processes or relevant type of procurement routes. And from the methodological point of view, the data set could be extended and findings needs to be generalized in other settings. But after this preliminary step, let's say, we did other research activities, both in the area of the procedural considerations framework, but also for the development of a session protocol with phases and activities to manage a design review meeting. And then we started to match phases of a design review process with procedural considerations in order to organize a procedural guidelines that could be a comprehensive but at the same time flexible basis for research and also for the industry to apply VR in a more systematic way. Also some open scenarios for future works. We know how to use VR if we organize our procedural considerations to support the process, but we should also start, and some researchers have already started, to quantify the added value of VR, to understand if it is useful for our scopes, and quantitative and comparative research should be proposed. And then there is the need also for some guidelines to select the right VR systems, full immersive, semi-immersive, non-immersive, multimodal interaction based on the objectives of the meeting, the interaction with the virtual facility prototype, the related users, and so on. Also, an important thing could be related to the cognitive processes that the use of VR systems could enhance and support. For example, how collaboration changes because of the use of VR systems. And again, contractual aspects should be further investigated, as well as specific design processes in order to extend the procedural considerations. Thank you.